Nadia Wells was 39 years old, and she had spent the last 18 months driving her husband to chemotherapy, managing his medications, sleeping on a cot beside his hospital bed during the weeks he could not be left alone, cooking the foods he could keep down when he could keep anything down at all, and holding his hand through the kind of nights that people who had not been in them could not accurately imagine. She drove a 2011 Accord she had owned since before the marriage. She wore the same work shoes for 2 years before they gave out. She had not had a haircut since the diagnosis because there had been no available Tuesday for one, and she had stopped noticing. The way you stopped noticing things that did not require your attention when everything that required your attention was in a hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. What the nurses on the oncology floor knew, and what her husband Fletcher's family knew, was that Nadia Wells was the most dedicated woman in that building on any given week and possibly in any given year. What Fletcher did not know, while he slept, and while she sat in the chair beside his bed reviewing the files on her laptop in the hours between his 2 in the morning checks and his 5 in the morning checks, was that the compound she had been developing for 8 years was moving through its final regulatory review, and that the patent application she had completed in a 12-hour session on a Sunday when Fletcher was stable and sleeping was sitting before the United States Patent and Trademark Office, with her name alone on the filing. The licensing value of the compound, once the patent was approved, was estimated at $2 million. The patent approval arrived on a Tuesday in March. The same morning Fletcher was discharged from the hospital with a clear scan and a future the doctors said was genuinely open. She read the notification on her phone in the parking garage while she was loading the wheelchair back into the trunk. She was still smiling about the patent when he said what he said. He said it quietly, in the car, on the way home, in the voice people used for things they had been holding for a long time and had finally decided to put down. He said, "I need you to know that I want a divorce." He said, "I have been seeing someone since before I got sick." He said, "The illness gave me time to be honest with myself about what I want." Nadia drove. She kept both hands on the wheel. She looked at the road. What Fletcher did not understand, what he would not understand until the following Monday morning, was that the woman beside him in the car had just received the confirmation that 8 years of quiet, methodical, relentless scientific work had produced something worth $2 million, and that every dollar of it had been earned entirely in her name during his illness, while he was being honest with himself about what he wanted. What happened next was not what he had expected from the quietest woman he had ever known. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning he came home from the hospital was the first Tuesday in March, and the light was thin and cold in the particular way of early spring in Memphis, when the season had announced itself in the calendar, but not yet in the air. Nadia had spent the previous evening preparing the house for his return. Fresh sheets, the kitchen stocked with the foods that had agreed with him through the latter months of treatment, the bathroom configured for the mobility limitations the physical therapist had outlined, the medication sorted into the weekly organizer she had been filling every Sunday for a year and a half. She had done all of it with the same methodical care she brought to everything she considered worth doing correctly, which was the same care she had brought to her work as a clinical research coordinator at a pharmaceutical company in Memphis, where she had spent 11 years managing the operational infrastructure of drug development trials, overseeing the documentation and the logistics and the regulatory submission timelines that turned laboratory science into medical fact. She was very good at it. She had always been very good at it. Her grandfather, a man named Walter Wells, who had worked 30 years as a laboratory technician at a hospital in Nashville, and who had been the person who first told Nadia when she was 11 and interested in everything, that the most interesting work in the world was the work done in the middle of things that other people could not yet see the outcome of, had died when she was 27. She had been at his bedside. He had told her that afternoon that she had always been built for the long work, the kind that required more patience than most people had, and produced results that arrived on the work's schedule, not on the workers. She had thought of that often in the 11 years since. She had thought of it often in the 18 months just past. She and Fletcher had met at a professional conference in Nashville 8 years before the diagnosis. He was in hospital administration, organized and present, and the kind of man who made decisions and followed through on them, which she had found at the time to be a quality worth paying attention to. He was warm in the easy way of people who move through rooms without friction, and he had the specific quality she had found rare, which was that he asked follow-up questions after she answered the first one. They had married 2 years after the conference. The first 5 years had been good in the genuine sense, a shared life built on compatible rhythms and mutual respect, and the kind of steadiness that was not dramatic but sustained itself, because it was true. By the 6th year, something had changed in Fletcher that she could not precisely name, but could measure in the ways she measured most things, which was through pattern. The phone that was no longer left on the kitchen counter, the evenings that ended earlier than they used to, the small hesitations between her questions and his answers that had not been there before. She had watched. She had not yet had enough. The diagnosis arrived at the end of the 7th year. Stage 3. The prognosis was serious, and the treatment would be long, and she had set everything else aside and been present for it completely, which was the kind of woman she was. The kind who did not leave when leaving would have been easy or understandable, or even, by certain measures, justified. She stayed because she had made a commitment, and because she believed in honoring commitments fully, which was a value her grandfather had modeled for 40 years, and which she had inherited the way she had inherited his patience and his interest in the long work. She had also kept working. She had taken a modified schedule at the company, working from home 4 days a week during the worst months, working from the hospital on her laptop during the nights she stayed over, and she had continued the compound development that she had been pursuing outside her formal employment for 6 years. On the research time her employer allocated as a professional development provision, on evenings and weekends, and the rare quiet hours that appeared between Fletcher's treatments. The compound was a small molecule drug candidate targeting a specific metabolic pathway implicated in a treatment-resistant inflammatory condition. She had been working on it since her 2nd year of graduate school, following a line of inquiry her dissertation advisor had said was too narrow to produce a commercially viable result. She had disagreed. She had continued. She had been right, which she had known she would be, but had not known when. She filed the patent application on the Sunday in October when Fletcher was stable and sleeping. In a 12-hour session at the kitchen table with the compound documentation and the research files and the application forms and a pot of coffee that she refilled 3 times. She sent the completed application at 11:47 at night, and then sat at the table for a few minutes and looked at the kitchen she had tiled herself the first year she and Fletcher were in the house. The handmade ceramic in the warm clay color she had chosen, because it reminded her of her grandfather's hands, and she thought, 8 years. She went to bed. She got up at 2 for Fletcher's medication. She had not told Fletcher about the patent application. She had not told him about the compound. She had not told him because there had been no space in 18 months for a conversation of that length and complexity, and because she was a woman who completed the work before she discussed it, and because she had learned in the years of watching him change that his response to her professional work had shifted from interest to something that she could only describe as the polite management of his own discomfort with it. The patent approval notification arrived at 7:41 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, in the parking garage of the hospital, while she was loading the wheelchair into the trunk after the discharge. She read it twice. She stood beside the car in the cold gray air of the garage and felt the particular weight of 8 years arriving at their conclusion. And then she put the phone in her pocket and finished loading the wheelchair and got behind the wheel. She was still carrying that feeling when Fletcher began to speak. She did not interrupt him. She drove. She let him finish every word because she was a woman who heard things completely before she responded to them, and she needed to hear this completely to understand its full shape. When he finished, she was 4 miles from the hospital. She was on the highway that led to their neighborhood. The morning was still cold, and the light was still thin, and the road was ordinary and familiar, and she was driving on it with 18 months of her life arranged behind her and 8 years of her work confirmed in her pocket, and a man beside her who had been honest with himself and found that what he wanted was not her. She did not cry. She kept both hands on the wheel. She thought of her grandfather. The most interesting work in the world is the work done in the middle of things that other people cannot yet see the outcome of. She could see the outcome now. She called her attorney that Monday morning from her car, parked in the hospital's visitor lot, because she had gone back the same day to speak with a colleague, a woman named Constance, who was a social worker on the oncology floor, and who had become, over 18 months of weekly contact, one of the people Nadia trusted most completely. Her attorney was a woman named Renata Gray, who practiced family law in Memphis from an office she had occupied for 16 years, in a building on Union Avenue where the hallway smelled of old wood, and the conference room had a window that faced a courtyard garden that Renata said she had never once looked at without finding it useful. She was a tall woman with natural silver at her temples, and the particular efficiency of someone who did not keep clients waiting, because she understood that a client's time in a lawyer's office was time spent on a problem they would rather not have. Renata reviewed the marriage timeline, the cancer treatment period, and the patent application and approval documentation in a single meeting that lasted 90 minutes. She asked 4 questions. The first was whether the compound research had been conducted on Nadia's employer-allocated research time or on her own time. Nadia said both, and that she had maintained documentation distinguishing the 2 periods with date-specific records going back 6 years, because she had understood from the beginning of the work that the question of intellectual property ownership would eventually matter, and that the answer would need to be provable to someone who had not been present for any of it. Renata said, "Of course you did." She wrote 1 note on her legal pad and moved to the next question. She placed the patent approval on her legal pad and noted the approved date, the applicant of record, and the licensing estimate Nadia had provided from the preliminary valuation her employer's IP attorney had conducted. She said the patent was separate property under Tennessee law, having been conceived, developed, and filed entirely by Nadia under Nadia's name, with no contribution from the marital estate beyond the time Nadia had allocated from within her own professional development provision. She said the licensing value was Nadia's, clearly, and she said it with the matter-of-fact confidence of a woman who had been reading the law for 22 years and was not in the habit of stating things she wasn't certain of. The second question was whether Nadia had documentation of Fletcher's relationship during the marriage. She said she had been gathering it for 7 months, not because she had been looking for it initially, but because she looked at things as a professional habit, and what she had found had gone into a file which had 17 entries. Renata said, 17. Nadia said, "I keep good records." She said it without emphasis, because it was simply true, and she did not find truth to require emphasis. The third question was whether there were financial assets Fletcher held that were not reflected in the joint filings, Nadia said she had suspicions, but not documentation. Renata said she would bring in her forensic accountant, a man named Gerald, who had worked with her on 14 prior cases, and whose thoroughness she described as the kind that did not require a second pass, because there was no gap a second pass would close that the first had not already addressed. Gerald had the answer in 4 weeks. Fletcher held a personal account at a separate institution containing $88,000 in deposits that corresponded in timing and amount to transfers from a business account belonging to the woman named Cora. Gerald's summary was 11 pages and characteristically precise in the way that his summaries were always precise, which was to say that every figure had a corresponding document, and every document had a corresponding date, and the dates told a story that Gerald had not needed to editorialize because the sequence spoke clearly enough on its own. The relationship had begun 23 months before the diagnosis, 14 months before Nadia had noticed anything was wrong, and had continued without interruption through the full 18 months of treatment, every weekly chemotherapy appointment, every hospital stay, every 2 in the morning medication check. Nadia read the summary at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning. She read it in the same chair where she had completed the patent application. She drank her coffee. She looked at the ceramic tile she had laid herself, the warm clay color that her grandfather's hands had been, and she thought of all the work that had happened at that table, and in the chair beside the hospital bed, and in the parking garage at 7:41 in the morning, and she thought of what her grandfather had said, and she decided he was right. Some work was done in the middle of things other people couldn't see the outcome of. She had seen the outcome. She was done waiting for Fletcher to. The reckoning did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in Renata's conference room, in the courtyard facing room, on a Thursday afternoon in April, the kind of April afternoon in Memphis, when the light was warm and the dogwoods along Union Avenue were in full bloom. Fletcher arrived with his attorney, a man named Warren who had a practice in Germantown and who had been given the material facts by Fletcher and had reviewed them and had called Renata's office twice before the meeting with questions that Renata had declined to answer on the grounds that the answers would be available in person. Fletcher sat down across from Nadia and looked at her in the way he had looked at her in the car in March, which was with the particular directness of a man who believed his honesty entitled him to something. He had told her what he wanted. He expected the process to be as efficient as his decision had felt. Renata placed the first document on the table. It was Gerald's forensic accounting summary. She walked through its 3 key findings: the personal account, the timing of the deposits, the source of the funds. Warren reviewed each page. He made notes. His expression did not change, but his pace slowed in the way a careful attorney's pace slowed when the documents were saying something the client had not mentioned. She placed the second document, the patent approval, with the applicant of record and the estimated licensing value and the filing date, which was a Sunday in October when Fletcher had been stable and sleeping in the bedroom down the hall, and Nadia had been at the kitchen table working for 12 hours. Renata said the patent was separate property. She said the licensing value was $6, $2 million, current estimate, subject to finalization. She said the figure would be part of the separate asset disclosure but not part of the marital estate calculation because it was not a marital asset. Fletcher looked at the patent approval. He looked at the date. Something moved across his face that was not quite surprise, because surprise required not having expected something, and Fletcher had not been thinking about the patent, because Fletcher had not known the patent existed. He said he hadn't known she was working on something like that. Renata said she understood. She placed the third document. It was Nadia's file of 17 entries, compiled over 7 months, documenting the relationship between Fletcher and the woman named Cora in the dated, observational manner of someone who had been trained to document things correctly. Renata said it would be relevant to any claim Fletcher intended to make regarding the spousal support provision in their state's equitable distribution framework, specifically the provision governing conduct during the marriage. Warren read the entries. He set the file down. He looked at his client. Fletcher looked at Nadia. He said he thought she was going to be reasonable about this. He said he had hoped they could handle it without making it adversarial. Nadia looked at him steadily. She had looked at him through the worst nights a human being could have, and she had not looked away. She was not going to look away now. She said, "I was reasonable for 18 months. She said she had been reasonable for considerably longer than that. She said she thought what she was being now was thorough, and she found that she did not see much difference. She stood. She gathered her bag. She nodded to Renata. She walked out through the conference room, through the hallway that smelled of old wood, and out into the April afternoon, where the dogwoods were in full bloom along Union Avenue, and the light was warm, and the world was doing what it always did, which was continuing on its own schedule, regardless of what any of the people in it had planned. 10 months later, Nadia Wells lived in a house she had purchased outright in the Cooper Young neighborhood of Memphis, a craftsman bungalow with a deep front porch and a back garden she had spent the summer establishing, choosing species for their hardiness and their bloom time, and the way they would look in combination when they reached their mature size, which would be in 3 years, which was a time frame that required patience, and which she had in full supply. The patent licensing agreement had been finalized in August with an upfront payment of $3, $1 million, and a royalty structure that her intellectual property attorney had negotiated with the precision of someone who understood that the initial terms were not the final terms, and that the final terms were worth the patience required to reach them. Nadia had reviewed every clause before signing. She had also returned to full-time status at the company, where her supervisor had reorganized her role to include oversight of a new research initiative in the same metabolic pathway her compound addressed, which was an acknowledgement that the 8 years had produced something the company intended to build from. She had accepted the role and was already 6 months into the next stage of the investigation, which was the part she had always preferred, the part in the middle of things where the outcome was not yet visible, and the work was everything. Her colleague Constance had introduced her to a man named Samuel, a hospital chaplain who had worked on the oncology floor for 12 years, and who had the particular quality of presence that people developed when they had spent a long time with other people in the hardest moments, which was a quality Nadia recognized and found herself unwilling to take for granted. He came to the back garden on a Sunday afternoon and helped her stake the late-season plants without being asked how to do it, and they ate dinner on the porch afterward in the easy quiet of 2 people who did not need the silence to be filled. Fletcher had returned to work at the hospital in May. The woman named Cora had ended the relationship in June, which Nadia heard from Constance without seeking the information. His family had learned about the full timeline through the divorce proceedings, and several of them had not spoken to him since, in the way that families sometimes went quiet about things they found difficult to defend. His mother had sent Nadia a card in September that Nadia had read once and placed in the drawer with the things she intended to keep, but did not need to look at again. On a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after the parking garage and the patent notification and the drive home, Nadia sat on the front porch of the Craftsman bungalow with her coffee and the early light coming through the dogwood tree in her front yard, which had not been blooming when she moved in and was beginning now to consider it. She thought of the parking garage. She thought of her hands on the wheel on the highway. She thought of the kitchen table and the 12-hour Sunday and the pot of coffee refilled 3 times, and of her grandfather saying, "You are built for the long work." She was. She had always been. Her grandfather had told her before she was old enough to understand it, and she had spent the years since proving it quietly in the middle of things, where the real work happened. She was free. She was solvent. She was in the middle of the next thing, which was exactly where she had always done her best work. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.